network intrusion is when somebody is able to get access to your network, and of course, in order to do that, they have to get access to one of your computers or one of your routers. You can have loss of data, and by loss of data, that can occur for various reasons, including your an attack by an attacker, for example, a denial of service or a distributed denial of service attack, or somebody breaking into your computer and actually just deleting the data. And we also have loss of privacy, and that is somebody coming in and reading things which they shouldn't be reading. And if you think about that, that can be, when we talk about an attacker, that could be somebody who's external to the network, that is somebody who's not an employee of the company. It could also be an employee of the company. And so we can distinguish between those two by saying that one is an insider and one is an outsider. And so if you think about it, who is probably going to have the most capability of causing problems? That's going to be an insider. And so that's actually a huge problem. So when you're considering protecting your network, you don't just consider people trying to break in externally, you also have to consider insiders as well. So the first step in defeating the enemy is to know your enemy. And so what exactly does that mean? There's different levels of skill with respect to intruders, both insiders and outsiders. You can have the novices who, they call them script kiddies, that can download a script and hit go in order to try to attack your network or break into your computer. And then you have the people who are very skilled and crafted and have very talented means of not only breaking into your computer or your network, but also hiding their trail. And so you need to know a little bit about both of those. So that really means that you need to be just as skilled as the attackers, or as skilled as you can be, in order to understand what they're doing and what they can do. Types of attackers. Knowing the types of attackers helps you anticipate what could possibly happen to your network. There's different motivations for breaking into systems. For example, status is that the attackers look at this as something to be bragged about. Is that, oh, well, I broke into IBM's network, I broke into Microsoft's network. Revenge is that's a huge one, especially for insiders. When somebody gets demoted or knows that they're going to be fired, one of the things they can do is try to screw up a computer system or a network, and that happens quite a bit. You don't hear about it a lot because a company doesn't want to admit that they have problems with their security, if you think about it, especially if they're on the New York Stock Exchange or something like that. Financial gain, we see that there's, if you go out on the internet and read, there's a lot of cyber gangs now that actually will target, and it seems like it's primarily online betting websites, and will try to extort money from them. And they say that you can actually search for this: extortion in online betting websites. That they will send an email indicating that if you don't give me $5,000 a day or $50,000 for this week, I'm going to bring down your website. Well, if the website online betting is making $10,000 a day or $50,000 a day or $1 million a week, it actually makes sense for them to go ahead and pay. And so that's actually been something that's occurring quite a bit. And industrial espionage, and that that occurs. Industrial espionage, as well as foreign state espionage, is just breaking into a computer to try to find out what kind of secrets they have, because there can be billions of dollars involved with new patents for new products. And so if one company can actually steal the product for another one and then beat them to the market, then that can be a gain of billions of dollars for one company and a loss of billions for the other. Types of attackers. Crackers. Notice that we don't use the term hacker. Hackers actually came out as a term that came out of in the 60s for young men at MIT and really places like that, high-tech universities, for people who enjoyed learning how things work. It started out with computers, but hacking just means that you want to really understand something, understand how it works, so you can have control over it. And so when you use the term hackers now, it has a pejorative negative term, and that's really not the case if you look back at how the term hacker really came about. So crackers means somebody who attempts to gain access to unauthorized resources by circumventing passwords, firewalls, or other protective measures. You have disgruntled employees, which is probably going to be the biggest threat to you if you're in a larger company. And why are they a bigger threat? Well, if you think about it, they have physical access already, and they also have some access to your network. All they have to do then is work from inside and figure out how the network works, what the computer security is, so they've got a leg up already. They may already have access to customer information, financial files, and job records, and plus they're sitting there at their desk within the physical perimeter of the building. One of the things that you should know is when an employee is terminated, security measures should be taken immediately, and essentially what's done now is that, and this seems very harsh, but there's a reason that they do this, is when somebody is fired, is you take that person, you don't tell the person that they're being fired, is you bring them to the office where they're being fired, and at that time, while they're sitting in the office being talked to, is that their network and computer privileges are taken away immediately, and then essentially they're escorted from there outside of the building. They don't get to go back to their office. And there's a reason for that, because when it isn't done that way, a lot of times they've gone back and actually caused a lot of harm to the computer and the network. Criminal and industrial spies, we've talked about a little bit. Script kiddies and packet monkeys. Packet monkeys block website activities using DDoS attacks, distributed denial of service attacks. You should already know what that is. If not, read that in the book. And script kiddies are young, immature computer, and it's not really computer programmers, it's kids who think that they're crackers, and they can download scripts from pretty much anywhere. I mean, there's websites out there that contain scripts, and then all you need to do is to point the script at a network and hit go, and you can cause a lot of havoc just by doing that. So later on we'll see some of the research I did a few years ago looked at intrusion detection systems and setting up something called the honeypot. And what we found is that there's lots of attacks going on that didn't make any sense. For example, we were running a Linux system, and there was a lot of attacks against an IIS web server for a server that was running the Linux operating system, which doesn't make sense. So essentially what somebody was doing is you had a script kiddie that downloaded something and just pointed it somewhere on the internet and hit go and was trying to get something in return. And you have terrorists. They attack computer systems for several reasons, and I have never actually heard of a real terrorist attacking a system. They do this for making a political statement, achieving a political goal. The terrorist attacks that I've heard of have essentially been between the Palestinians and the Israelis, breaking into a web server and defacing their web page. And if you think, well, is that a terrorist? Well, that's really not causing any critical damage to the system. They're just trying to make a statement. However, having said that, if somebody breaks into the Israeli forces defense system or the U.S. Department of Defense system, we're probably not going to hear about it. So realize that there could have been some sorts of terrorist attacks. We just don't know about it. Okay, what is malicious code? Malicious code is also known as malware, and that's anything that falls under the rubric of computer code that can cause damage to your system. And what these malware does is use systems' well-known vulnerabilities to spread to other systems and to do harm to your system. And there's many different types of malware, including viruses. And viruses and worms are really distinct animals. A virus is code that copies itself in a secretive manner. That's what the word surreptitiously means. And they also have a payload. If you think about a missile has a payload. A rocket has a payload. What is the payload? It's a thing there, usually on the end of the system or somewhere in the missile or rocket, that actually does the damage. So usually a missile is going to have a megaton payload where it hits something and it blows up. Well, viruses are the same way. Viruses, depending upon who creates them, can have a payload that deletes files in your hard drive, or it can simply display a message to the user, or just sit there and do absolutely nothing. And there's different methods that the viruses spread, including when somebody runs executable code, actually the virus will connect to executable code, and so when you run the executable code, the virus runs as well, and then it actually replicates itself to other files. It's also done by sharing disks or memory sticks, is that It's self-executing, so once you plug something in, that it can actually execute. And opening email attachments is another big one. Is when you, and that's actually related to running the executable code. If you recall, there a few years ago there was the I love you virus. That there was a message sending an email with an attachment, and the message says love letter for you, and then there was an attachment that had the extension .text. I love you.text. Actually, the text was I love you.vbs.text. VBS is a Visual Basic Scripting Language, and when somebody clicked on that, what it did was is it replicated. It went in and looked in the, and actually this runs under Windows, and it got the first, I believe it was the first 50 recipients in the address book, and would actually send emails of the same type to the first 50 recipients. And that's because somebody actually clicked on that file that looked like it was a text file, but actually it wasn't. Worms are different from viruses in that they can actually copy themselves without actually being attached to another file. They don't require user intervention to be launched, and some worms install backdoors on the system. And what a backdoor is that it's an open gateway that allows an attacker to actually access the system surreptitiously. Essentially what it does is it opens a way of allowing an outside user to gain unauthorized access to a computer or the resources. And worms too can have payloads, so they can destroy data on hard disks if they like, or they can just replicate. One of the first ones was the Morris worm, which was in 1988, and that was one that was created by Robert Morris, whose father worked for the NSA, and I believe he was at Princeton at the time, the son, not the father. And he created a worm just to see if it would work and how far it would replicate. Well, there was some of the code that he didn't write correctly, because it was what was supposed to happen was that the worm was supposed to infect a computer, and then once it was infected, it was supposed to realize that and then stop replicating on that computer. Well, as it turns out, he didn't write the code correctly, and so what happened was is that it would infect the computer over and over and over again, and then it would infest other computers on the network, and it just about brought down the internet. Of course, the internet back then was very, very small, but it still had a great impact on the internet. You have Trojan programs, which are, if you think of a Trojan horse, is that it's a program that pretends to be one thing, but it's actually another. And so what the attacker does is it creates a program that he hopes that the user will not know is a nefarious, bad program, and that will try to either install it or try to do something to actually get that on their computer. And so those two are used for different means, including spyware and adware. Can fall under the rubric of Trojan horse. They can also create backdoors, which allows a user to access the computer. And some of the later on we'll talk about some of the other programs that did that were actually quite powerful and have actually good uses, but they can also be used for nefarious purposes. Then you have macro viruses, and macros are scripting languages that can be used on a computer to actually do good things. You know, Word uses the Visual Basic Scripting macro language. And so quite a few years ago, people were writing macro languages, macro viruses rather, to actually infect computers. And so when somebody opened up a Word document or an Excel document, there was a macro in that would actually initiate its payload. And so now if you see that if you do use Word or Excel and you open up a document that has a macro, Word will actually say that this has a macro, do you want to run it or not? And if you don't know who actually sent you that document, you should certainly say no. Other threats to network security. Realize it's not possible to prepare for every possible risk to your systems, because there's some risks that you just don't know about. For example, code that was written poorly. And so you have to rely on Microsoft or the people at the various other operating companies to actually update their software and give you patches to protect you. But what you can't try to do is to do the best you can to protect your environment for today's threats. That is, the threats that you know about, which means that you need to be educated. You need to be out there making sure that your systems are patched on a regular basis, and you're also reading all the vulnerabilities documents that come out. You can also be prepared for tomorrow's threats, that is the things you don't know, by having a good security policy that states that what you're supposed to do if you are attacked. And we'll talk more about security policies next week. What's a big problem with attacking is social engineering, and that is the people factor, is that you're only as good as your weakest link. And social engineering is essentially trying to gain access to resources through people. For example, if I call you up and I say, hi, let's say you're working at a help desk and you say, hi, I'm the secretary for the president of the company and he can't get in. He needs to change his password to such and such. Would you please go ahead and change that password now? There's been lots of cases of something like this actually occurring. And the person at the help desk, if they have the access to that, can change the password, which means now that the person who called, which really had nothing to do with the company, has access to the president's account. Why is this bad? Because employees do not always observe, or not why is it bad, it's clear why it's bad, but why does this occur? Employees do not always observe accepted security practices. For example, they may put their passwords on a post-it note and stick that on their monitor. That's not good security practice. So somebody comes in, pretends they're a janitor, walks around, writes down everything that's on the sticky notes, and then is able to access the network just because of that practice. And also, employees are fooled by attackers into giving up passwords or other access codes, and this happens a lot more than you think. And if you think about the other types of attacking, such as phishing, phishing, look that up in the book. That's a form of social engineering. It's somebody's trying to get you to give you their password and username, social security number, date of birth, mother's maiden name. I've had some really interesting phishing scams try to be run against me. Okay, this is some of the common attacks and defenses. You read this on your own. Denial of service attack, we've talked about it. SYN flood is a form of denial of service attack. You see viruses and Trojan horses, programs, social engineering, malicious port scanning. Port scanning in itself is not malicious because as a systems administrator, and this is something you'll do in this class, is you'll learn to port scan. And essentially what that's doing is that's a way of auditing your network. A port scan is accomplished by using a piece of software to actually go out and determine what systems, what hosts are up, and what ports they have open. You always want to know that because you don't want ports open that should not be open, because it's essentially another possible avenue of infiltration into your system. ICMP, message abuse, you can, and actually that's kind of a form of denial of service attack, so I don't know why they didn't include that up here in the DOS, but there's something called a Smurf attack that can be used as a denial of service. Some of the defenses now, finding a vulnerable host on the internal network to attack. Some of the things you can do, you can use proxy servers. Man-in-the-middle attacks is when an attacker operates between two computers in a network and impersonates one computer to intercept communications. If you use encryption in a virtual private network, that is one way to reduce the possibility of that being a problem. New files being placed on the system, such as viruses and so on, you need to make sure that you have access control as to who can access what accounts, who can access what directories, who can install a program, who can modify a program, and so on. RPC attacks, remote procedure call attacks. You can set up an intrusion detection system, and we'll talk more about that later. Okay, let me see what we've got in here. A socket is a port number combined with a computer's address. So when you're talking about a socket, for example, let's see if we can get a socket. Oh, I can't do that right here. Okay. We'll look at sockets later. Attacker software looks for open sockets. In other words, they're looking for a host that is up, and they look for ports that are running a service. That's essentially what this is saying right here. Email and communications. Home users regularly surf the web, use email and instant messaging programs. And so if you think about it, let's say you bring one of your thumb drives and you stick it into your computer, and then you're running your email and web surfing at home, and you're not as concerned about your security at home, so you don't have a good firewall. And you click on some files that are email attachments, and they end up installing a Trojan horse on your computer, and then that Trojan horse somehow installs itself on your thumb drive. Then you take your thumb drive out and you take it to work and you plug it in, and guess what? Now you've infected an entirely new network just because you weren't careful at home. And that's why it's important that you update your system at home and also get a good firewall and a virus scanner for your home computer, because it can end up infecting other networks and computers as well. Scripts, okay, we've talked about that. Always on connectivity. If you've got a broadband, that means that you're probably always on. You're not using a modem and dialing up and connecting to the internet that way. The problem with always on connections is that they're easier to locate and attack because they're always on. And so if you think about when you were using, I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember this, but when you would use a dial-up modem, you would get on and you would stay on for 30 minutes, an hour, maybe 2 hours, and then you would log off. Well, the next time you got on, the DHCP server would, from the company from which you were getting your internet access, would allocate you another IP address. So every few hours or every few days, you were getting another IP address. However, now, more than likely, you're having the same IP address for days or weeks or even months. I think I've had mine for quite a few months right now, which means that I know not only your IP address, but I also know that the ports you're running, the ports that you have open, and so now I can take my time and actually throw a lot of different exploits at your system to see if I can gain access to it. And that's why with always on connections, you need to be even more careful about the security you use. So you use a good firewall, you use a good, you turn off the services which you don't absolutely positively need. You always make sure you patch your system, and you have a good virus scanners, particularly if you're running Windows. Okay, goals of network security. This isn't all of them, but this is called the CIA triad. The goals of network security include confidentiality, and that means that you have good security because you want to make sure that the information you have is only read by the people that should have access to it. For example, if you're talking about nuclear plans for the Department of Defense, you have a limited number of people who should access that information. If you're working for Microsoft and you have some new software coming out, you don't display that to everybody. You have a set few people that can read that information. And so network security allows us to keep the confidentiality of documents to a small set or a targeted set of people. Integrity. You don't want people changing information that should not be changing it, or people who are allowed to change information but change it in a way that's not consistent with reality. And so there's ways of doing that, and ways of making sure that confidentiality and integrity are maintained, as well as availability, which means that when somebody needs access to a system, they should be able to access the system. If we think about some of the attacks we talked about earlier, what is one that would reduce the availability of a service? Denial of service attacks and distributed denial of service attacks. So if somebody needed access to a document or a web service and there was a denial of service attack going on, then they wouldn't be able to access the information. And so all of these are critical goals of computer and network security. Providing secure connectivity. It says in the past, network security emphasized blocking attackers from accessing the corporate network. That's outsiders. Now security deals with trusted users in networks, because you have just as many problems from insiders as outsiders on occasion. So you need to be just as concerned with internal network security as external network security. Activities that require secure connectivity. You can take a look at that yourself. Of course, each of those, what is of concern here? Let's take a look at this. Let's think of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Placing orders for merchandise online. Do you want those orders to be confidential? Yes, because what's going on over line? You're sending your personal information and credit card information. Paying bills is the same. Accessing account information. Do you want somebody going in and changing your account information so the pay to goes to them? That would be involved with integrity. Do you want to make sure you can pay your bills on time? What if you wait to the last minute to pay your bill, your credit card bill, and you try to log on and you can't because there's just distributed denial of service attack going on against one of your banks, and creating authentication information, looking up personnel records. You don't want people who should not have access to that being able to intrude into a network and being able to get that information, posting it on the internet and selling it for a profit. Secure remote access. Nowadays you have more and more people working from home, and which is a good thing because you can save a lot of money and time by not having to commute and using up a lot of gas. At the same time, these people are having to access the servers on the corporate network. So how do you do that to make sure that you have not only authentication, making sure that the person logging in is the person that should be logging in, but also that any of the information that crosses the network remains confidential. And one way you do that is through virtual private network, which we'll talk about later, which uses public-private key encryption as well as symmetric encryption to make sure that the packets that are crossing the network remain obfuscated. You can get free VPN solutions. You can get extremely expensive VPN solutions, and the one you select depends upon your needs, and we'll talk some about that later on in the course. This is showing a VPN setup. You have the, let me see how we're doing this. This is actually going through, this isn't somebody working from home, this is going through computers over here need to access in here. And so you have your LAN gateway, your router, your firewall, and then right here is where the virtual private network occurs. And so right in here, this could actually be traveling over the internet. And so let's say instead of this over here, you actually only have a single computer. And so you could have a computer right here that connects to this router with IPsec, which is Internet Protocol Security. We'll talk about that later. And so everything that's going on between here and here is encrypted. And so this would have been a much better slide if they'd showed that this is like going through the internet. This looks like it's going through a company. A single company. So if you have the internet in here, everything that's going between here and here across the internet is encrypted. So even if somebody were able to sniff the network within here, which is possible but difficult, all they're seeing is encrypted messages. It's very difficult, depending upon the algorithms you use for the encryption, to actually decipher those messages. Ensuring privacy. What's the difference between privacy and confidentiality? There is a little difference. Privacy typically deals with personal information. We know that personal or financial information needs to be protected, and there's a lot of laws now that are protecting people, protecting people's credit card information. HIPAA, the Health Information Privacy and Protection Act, is for health information to make sure that health agencies protect your information. Education is an effective way to maintain the privacy of information. And notice down here it talks about education and security policy. So if you think about it, when you want to do something correctly, you think about it beforehand and you set guidelines or rules or heuristics that indicate how to do things correctly. And this is the same thing with security, is that you think about what your network infrastructure is, what type of protection you need for the different types of files that you have on your network, and you set security policies to protect those policies. But then you also have to train and educate the users of those so that they understand what the security policies are. So without security policies, training, and education, you're not getting the most effect out of your security as you could as if you did have those. Also, employees are most likely to detect security breaches. So what you've got is rather than just relying on your systems administrators to determine whether there's been a security breach, you have another set of eyes, or another set of thousands or hundreds of thousands or tens of eyes looking at what's going on in your system, as long as they know what to look for. So they have to be trained and educated. Also, employees can monitor activities of their coworkers, which sounds like something out of Big Brother and 1984, if you've ever read that book. It looks like essentially you're spying on people, but sometimes it's a good thing because it can actually cost you your job if you're not watching what coworkers are doing. If you see something that looks funny, you should report that. Non-repudiation, remember CIA? This is one that I would have added to CIA, although now it would be CIAN. Non-repudiation. Non-repudiation means that if I send you an email, let's say in the email it says that there's a contract, and that by sending me an email back that we've got a contract for you to buy services. And so you send an email back saying, why yes, I will pay you $10,000 for this service. And later on, I deliver the services to you, and you say, hey, I've got the services, but I never sent this email. Non-repudiation means the capability of showing that you were the only one that could have sent that email indicating that you would pay for these services. And we'll see how to do this later, and it involves encryption and digital signatures. And so when we start talking about encryption, we will see that encryption provides integrity, confidentiality, and the ability to authenticate digital information. And gives another definition of non-repudiation: the capability to prevent one participant from denying that it performed an action. And so this is becoming more and more important when we're talking about doing business over the web, because otherwise, if you weren't doing this electronically and you always have to have a face-to-face communication, you always had to sign something in person, you would greatly reduce the capability of conducting e-commerce. Okay, we've already talked about this. Take a look at this for a second. Confidentiality prevents intentional or unintentional disclosure of communications between a sender and a recipient. Integrity ensures the accuracy and consistency of information during all processing. Availability makes sure that those who are authorized to access resources can do so in a timely and reliable manner. Hey, there's a triangle. Okay, network defense technologies and layers. We talked about layers last time. Remember, no single measure can ensure complete network protection. So rather what we do is we add layers. We call this defense in depth. It's a layered approach to network security. So we just don't make sure we have passwords on our computers. We make sure we have passwords. We make sure we have some sort of access controls for the files, so that a person can only access the files to which they need to work on. And what else do we have? We might have a host-based intrusion detection system, which we'll talk about when we start talking about IDSs. And we may have several firewalls with varying layers of or very different rules depending upon where the computers are residing in the network. And we could have network intrusion detection systems. We could have proxy servers. We could have a demilitarized zone. We could have packet filters that are sitting on the outside of the network. And so what essentially we're doing is that if somebody gets past that first layer of defense, then they've got 10 other defenses to try to get to in order to get to that information that they want. If they get to the first 2, then they have 9 more layers. If they get through the first 3, they have 8 more layers. So essentially what happens is unless the attacker is very determined to get at that information, they're going to turn around and hightail it to somebody who isn't using those defenses. Physical security, you also need, this is just as important as electronic security. Because let's say that you've got this great network security defense set up, but you're not using good locks on your system. Your network servers, which are internal to your business, have the door open. They you don't force people to wear badges and to authenticate themselves when they come into the building. You're essentially allowing people to actually get around those network security defenses by actually using physical breaches into your system. And so it's important then as an IT administrator that you also look into these things as well. Computer locks, locked protected rooms for your critical servers, burglar alarms, and UPSs. Well, why is that physical security? Well, if your network goes down, you're reducing the availability of those network services, that information, to people who need that. And so UPSs provide some measure of access, at least for as long as the UPSs are up. And then also for even larger corporations who must have 24/7 access, such as banks, you could have generators as well. I mean, I've been to one of the largest banks in the United States and seen their network room, and they have incredible UPSs that are, I forgot how large it was, 10 feet by 12 feet of car batteries that actually kick in once the electricity goes out, and then they have power generators that are just huge that actually run their system because they're a worldwide bank. Okay, authentication. Authentication means that you need to authenticate to your computer to tell who you are and to prove that by using some measure of either something you know, something you have, or something that you are. And we'll talk about that shortly. So essentially how this occurs now is through passwords. It's a very simple strategy. It works. And of course we know that you should select good passwords, which should be, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later. What is a good password? It's a password that is at least 8 characters, if not more, and uses a combination of lowercase characters, uppercase characters, numbers, and special characters. And it's also not something that you write down and stick on a post-it note and leave on your computer. You should always use different passwords for different applications, although that's very hard. A little later on we'll talk about single sign-on applications for doing this. So how can you authenticate to a system? There's different ways of doing this. Something you know, something you have, or something that you are. Something user knows is essentially a PIN or a password. That's something that you know. Something that you have could be an access token like an RSA secure ID card. So in other words, in order to log in, you have to not only know your username, but also you have to have that secure token to log in, or something that you are. And this deals with biometrics. So now when we talk about something that you are, this is talking about a fingerprint, a palm print, a signature analysis, an iris scan, let me see what else. I know I've left off a lot. A facial scan, things of that nature. And so that's becoming more commonplace because if you can increase the reliabilities of these systems, then you can always log in anywhere you are because you're not going to forget your password, and maybe you've lost your token, but you've always got your thumbprint or your iris to be scanned. Operating system security. We've talked a little bit about this. You need to protect your operating system as well as your applications that are running on top of the operating system. You need to make sure your patches, hotfix, and service packs are regularly scheduled, and that can be done quite easily. You should stop any unneeded services, which we've talked about. There's no reason to run an FTP service or a telnet service if you're not going to be needing that, because that's just another thing that can be attacked by an insider or an outsider. And no one needs a guest account. And if you ever installed any operating system and looked at the services that are turned on by default, there's tons of them that you're not going to need. So the first thing I do when I install an operating system, Windows or Linux, I think Mac is the best one about not turning on unnecessary services, but like installing Red Hat or Fedora or Windows, is you go in and you start disabling all the unneeded services, because there's a ton of them. You're going to need antivirus protection, more so for Windows systems than for Linux or the Macintosh. Virus scanning is very important. Make sure you get a good one. There are some free ones. Antivirus software uses virus signatures to detect viruses in your system, and those should also be updated on a daily basis. Firewalls and IDSs are not enough because they do not catch viruses, and we'll see why later on. So you're going to need a virus protection in addition to firewalls and IDSs. Notice that you should install antivirus software in hosts and all network computers. So anything that gets a packet should have an antivirus protection on it. Packet filtering. Okay, you can look at these notes yourself because we're going to go into this extensively. I'm not sure why this is in here, but we're going to spend a couple of weeks on packet filtering and firewalls. A DMZ, we'll talk about that. Intrusion detections, we're going to spend a couple of weeks on that. We're going to spend a couple of weeks on virtual private networks. We're going to look at network auditing and log files, and so on. We will actually do this. I'll give you a log file and say, hey, what's happening here? Jump back here. Here's what you're going to do. You're going to create a packet filtering firewall. I'll tell you what your security policy should be, and you're going to create one. You're going to do that in Linux. Intrusion detection system, I'm going to have you create some intrusion detection signatures. VPN, I'm not sure if we're going to be able to do anything with a VPN, but let me work on that. We're going to work with some network auditing and log files. So I'm going to give you a certain set of log files. You have to correlate those and tell me what went on. And graphical representation of log files. That's real great, but you're going to do yours in Linux. Routing and access control methods. We'll talk more about this later on. Access control deals with having access not either to a computer, a network, or to specific files on a system. You have different methods of access control. You have mandatory access control. It's what's used in the military. And so you have read-write access depending upon whether a document is classified as confidential, secret, top secret, and as to whether your clearance is confidential, secret, or top secret. Discretionary access control is what you've probably got on your home computer right now, or your Windows 98 box, or your Linux box, and what that means is that the person using the computer actually doles out access to the files on the computer. And role-based access control is when a person in a particular role, let's say a role would be a particular position in a company, and so let's say the president of the company has a particular role in the company, so they should have access to various files which they need to work on, and so anybody acting as president and logging in as president would actually have access to those files. So it's not necessarily the person logging in as an individual that is accessing the files. It's actually the role that they're playing at the moment. Okay, the impact of defense. Cost of securing systems might seem high, but in the long run, if you think about it, it can save you a lot of money. And typically, this is what happens in companies, is that they go skimpy on the security until they're hit, and then all of a sudden they realize how much money they've lost. Then they're going to spend a lot of money on security, sometimes even security they don't even need. And so that's why it's you as assistant administrator to properly sell security in your company. And hopefully you do that from a top-down fashion, as you get the managers and the vice president, the CIO involved in these decisions, and so that you have people at the various highest levels understanding the importance of security so that you don't have to constantly sell that to everybody else. Okay, the summary, we've talked about all this. You can look at this on your own. And that's going to end this this iClass. Next time we're going to talk about security policy, so until then, make sure you go through these notes. Make sure that you've got your Linux working, make sure that you've got Windows working, and let me see else. Make sure you're getting that book and read the first and second chapters.